It's Andy Austin here. I'm up in the attic. I'm just making a cup of tea here. I'm going to be telling you about the 3 pillars model. I want to give you some of the advanced considerations that I have, what I think are the advanced considerations. It's stuff that's not necessarily going to be taught on your practitioner course. So as you're going to remember, the 3 pillars model is a very simple thing. Originally I called it the 3 pillars of depression, because I recognized this was an incredibly common pattern with depressives. And that when I showed depressives the 3 pillars model, they were like, oh my God, that explains my depression, I understand. It goes beyond depression, and I think we will find this really underlying an awful lot of quality of life problems. I suspect it's going to be very common for any issue arising from learned helplessness. I don't have any data to back this up. It's just my sort of general feeling. I just want to recap for those of you who don't know the origin story, the creation myth of this particular thing. I was working with a bunch of patients that a local GP sent to me over one summer. He sent me all of his chronic fatigue clients and his anxious clients. And I started to essentially distill out some of the patterns that I saw between those people. The patterns of chronicity appeared during that time as well. With the anxious people, what I recognized was the eye movement work that I was doing wasn't particularly successful in getting a result. A lot of these people reported things like guilt issues. A lot of them got angry quite easily with me or with the process or with something else that would trigger them. I recognized that guilt was very allied with anxiety, so was anger. As I started to time emotional states and really pay attention to the emotional chain that people went through, the way you can do this, video the client. Those who've trained with me know well my insistence that you video yourself, positioning the camera over the shoulder of the client to record yourself when you're working with people. You get a really good representation of what your client sees. If you're horrified by that, good. It means you can do something about it. I was also filming clients, and one of the things you can do when going through the video is start to notice some of the more obvious micro expressions. I don't know if that's even a thing, but the more obvious sort of subtle things that people are good at masking the greater expressions, but they can't help but give away how they're feeling. Time how long these feelings last for, what came before it, what comes next. And you can start to get an emotional chain. There were things like clients would arrive and they would be all apologetic. They might be a little bit late, or they might worry that they're late. They would feel guilty about taking up my time. I'm so sorry. I really hope you can help me. I'm so sorry to take up your time. I know that you're very important. They would do those kind of self-effacing things, which of course is how I make my money. Of course I want you to come and see me. They'd be apologetic. What I would notice is that the people who arrived feeling a bit guilty or expressing guilt very quickly within the session would start expressing anxiety. Some people would arrive anxious, so they're the early ones. They're standing waiting at the end of the drive. I was working from home at the time, smoking that cigarette, and they're clearly anxious people. They would arrive, and usually within 20 minutes, they'd be angry about something. It might be me, it might be something they've remembered, it might be something they're bringing up in the session. Some people would arrive angry. They couldn't find anywhere to park. One of my neighbors, I had some horrible neighbors. One of my neighbors they were old, was rude to them. They were rude neighbors. They would arrive angry, and they might be irritated by that. And usually within 20 minutes, they'd be all apologetic and expressing guilt and so forth. So these things became quite obvious once I became aware to look for them. Then in videoing the sessions as well, I could track them through the session. So that was how this particular 3 pillars model came about. And then I started to draw it out in the model that you'll be familiar with, or the diagram. And I would show this to clients and then explain the patterns to them. The depressives, the vast majority of them would say that really makes a lot of sense. The way this comes about is inconsistent rule structures. So some people are raised in a family environment where the rules are constantly changing according to the mood or the emotional state or whatever is going on of the parents. And so the kids never know whether they're coming or going or not. And they don't know how they're supposed to be. They don't know how they're supposed to behave or feel because there's no consistency. When I worked in mental health, one of the things I implemented when I was on duty was my rule structure was absolutely rigid and utterly inflexible. What I recognized was that when people try to be all accommodating people pleasers, that kind of mentality, it makes people a little bit insecure and they don't know what's going on. By having a rigid rule structure with no flexibility, people can find their way to navigate a way through and around the rules as they need to, as opposed to worrying what the rules are today, who's on duty, how do things change, do I have to be like this or be like that? Workplaces suffer the same issue with inconsistent and poor management. Where there's an inconsistent rule structure, employees can be very anxious about how they're supposed to perform. I've had this experience myself in a very short-lived contract before I quit on the spot. I literally just walked out of the job. My manager was one of those nightmare managers who would say one thing but mean something else, incongruent communication, and would issue rules in the morning, but they'd all be completely different by the afternoon, depending on her mood. No one knew whether they were coming or going or not. I recognized within 2 days of working there, I became anxious to make a simple decision. I would be anxious whether I'd go and make everyone a tray of tea for the staff. I'd worry about what was going to happen if I did that. Would she approve? Would she disapprove? What's going to happen? Ridiculous. So I quit in a very, very short space of time. So inconsistent rule structure gives rise to this pattern of the 3 pillars. Let's just go through this. So I'll put it up on the screen here so you can have a look. So in the first column, we've got guilt, shame, regret, and remorse. I always put it in that order. You can put it in any order you like, because that way I can always remember. I always have the same order. Yeah, I can just roll off. Guilt, shame, regret, remorse. In the middle column, anxiety, panic, and worry. And then we have anger and temper. Let's just get some differentials between these. Anger and temper. Anger is the emotional state. Temper is very much about the behavior. I can feel angry, I can have a temper. So I can be known to have a temper even though you never see me angry. So one is a trait, one is a state. The reason I put them both in there is because people tend to use these things interchangeably. There's the semantic issues as well, is that people can argue semantics about what's correct, what's not correct, and so forth. Now, anxiety is very much the somatic, adrenaline-type physiological experience. Panic is when it trips threshold, and panic is largely an involuntary action. Anxiety, people can do something about it. Once people are into panic, it can be very, very difficult. My days of working in accidents and emergency taught me that people go into a threshold where now the physiology takes over. And that's where we used to do the old paper bag over the face, suffocate them. It calms them down. By the way, that's not done anymore. They've got much better processes. The juggling ball can work quite nicely. But the old positive feedback loop of hyperventilation and hyperoxygenation, they used to try and abort that or interfere with it by the old paper bag rebreathing to get some carbon dioxide back in, because the physiology takes over. If you ever spend time in an accident and emergency department, you're going to see people brought in on a fairly regular basis, I mean several a day, who look like they're dying. They look like they're having a heart attack. They're a horrible color. They look absolutely ashen and like a heart attack patient. And this will be a panic attack. What they all report, they don't feel anxious, they don't feel panicky. They just thought they were dying. But they're still not panicked about that. And worry. And worry tends to be, again, it's a semantically loaded term that different people will use. Some people say, oh, it's my nerves, doctor, it's my nerves. Some people go, I don't get anxious. I'm not an anxious person. I worry a lot. And it all depends on which label we like to use for different things. a lot of the labels that we use for our experience depend on the family background we come from, what is understood within our subcultural groups that we're from, and so forth. So people may well use slightly different terms to describe exactly the same thing, or identical terms to describe entirely different processes. But they're nicely grouped because they have similarities about the rules and time orientation. In some cultures, I wasn't aware of this, and I've learned this through teaching internationally. Some cultures don't have differentials for guilt, shame, regret, remorse that we have in English. So in some countries, guilt and shame are actually the same thing. They don't have a differential. I found this in Israel recently. I did a quick session for a group there, and they couldn't translate guilt and shame as different terms. So they had to be explained in terms of rule structure and time orientation and so forth. And often people use regret and remorse interchangeably to mean the same thing too. So let's just go through these now in sequence to go through what they actually are and their considerations for time and rules. So guilt is about breaking rules. Specifically, I will feel guilty not for breaking your rules, I feel guilty for breaking my rules. People don't tend to feel guilty for breaking the speed limit. But if I have a principle that I live by, and I find myself in error of that, I breached it, then I can feel guilty. These rules that can trigger guilt may be shared by other people. They may be entirely specific and unique to the individual. What this means is it can be very hard for that person to get anyone else to understand about their guilt. Because to everyone else, they go, well, that's ridiculous. What are you worried about that for? Well, it's easy because the rules don't apply to everybody else. It only applies to that individual. And so guilt's very much about the behavior, whereas shame is much more about identity. We shame people. Naming and shaming is very important. We don't name and guilt people. We name and shame people. This is about the public humiliation. This is about the identity of the person as the rule breaker. I can be ashamed of myself because I see myself as a bad person who did a bad thing. So shame is about identity, guilt's about the behavior. But shame also has an observer component. So I need to be shamed either by other people or to be seen by those other people, or I'm ashamed of myself. Now, you understand the identity work. I am ashamed of myself. So I is ashamed and self is shamed. If that makes sense. So I am ashamed. So I, complex equivalency, am ashamed. And there's also the shame of self. So we could work through those things. It gets quite complicated. So with shame of self, there's an element of dissociation to have an observer and recipient of the observation. Shame in a cultural setting is we have the recipient of the shame and those who do the shaming. The issue here, if I'm ashamed of myself, is are we working with how I shame myself or what self has done to be shamed, and who did the act for which the identity is being blamed? So did I act or did self act? Am I ashamed for my self-expression? Very, very common in social anxiety. People self-express in a certain way, and I, later on, catches up with what actually happened, reviews that whole thing, and go, you, as in self, should be ashamed of yourself. I am ashamed of myself. I hate me. You get how it works, right? So we can start to tease those things out. Shame doesn't always happen there and then. It's with hindsight and reflection when we review our social conduct. Now remember, self is the expression of I. Self is the social face of I, but I is what commands the action in the first place. Now, if I'm ashamed of myself and I'm trying to change myself, I will still be the transgressor and the horrible person who likes to shame others or self. It gets complicated. Regret is I feel bad for the consequences to myself. These are all about breaking rules, of course. So I feel bad for the consequences to myself. I've always attributed this bit to Steve Andreas, but he denied that he ever said this to me, but I'm sure he did, which is regret will always find a target. Regret comes first, and then it latches onto something. And what I know so well is you can regret anything. You can regret the decisions you made. You can regret the decisions you didn't make. You can regret the opportunities you took, and you can regret those things you didn't do. So you can even regret omission of action as well as action itself. Regret is incredibly comforting, and this is important to understand. I forget now who wrote this. This is a famous classical English text, which is, regret gets a man through a very long night. Oh, that was suicide. I can't remember now. But essentially it's this. If I regret my life decision, so here is a very, very common one. I know this because when I say this at workshops, I watch people's faces react. How many people, somewhere through life, of married or in a long-term relationship, wake up one morning and they realize they're not happy? This relationship is not quite as fulfilling as I'd like it to be. The sex life has withered away. The interest is no longer there. We now have nothing to say to each other. When we go out for dinner, we just sit awkwardly and don't know what to say and just basically hope it ends quickly so we can all go home and get on with our silence. The person who wakes up to that reality may well spend an awful lot of time when they're on their own in regret. And they can regret in a number of ways. They might regret not marrying that hot guy or hot girl they could have done, who was fantastic all those years ago. And of course, now memory is only framing that experience in a positive way. They weren't the nutter they really were at the time. No, they were great. How different I would be now and how happy I would be now if only I had gone with that person instead, or if only I had not gone with this person. And people can occupy themselves by creating a parallel reality for themselves as to how different now would be if only they had made a different decision back then. And they can make infinite number of alternative realities for themselves. And in those realities, of course, they're happy and fulfilled. What this enables them to do is to never address the current situation they've really got. They never have to actually make an effort to change anything. They can entertain themselves and comfort themselves with their parallel realities, which are essentially ratifying regret. As a result, they won't improve their situation or change the situation. They just get to continue in the same shitty situation. And remorse is the only one on this list that is time dependent. Remorse is, I feel bad for the consequences upon other people for how I have acted. And that does tend to fade over time. And this is where prisoners seeking early release, they can be paraded in front of the parole board. And one of the things they're assessed on is, do they show adequate signs of remorse? Quite difficult when it was 20 years ago, or however many years ago it was. That can be quite tricky, because in that intermediate time, I imagine there's been a lot of time for regret and parallel realities. So some people will express regrets. Yeah, I do regret what happened because, look what happens to me. I've ended up here, haven't I? And all these things, horrible things that happen in prison. That's regret, not remorse. So remorse can often be faked out of necessity. If I say I'm sorry, that is one of those cultural tokens that basically says, I did this thing, I'm so sorry. You now have to accept and forgive me. If you don't forgive me, so I apologize, you don't forgive me, well, I now get I get to play the part. You're the arsehole for not forgiving me. I've said sorry, if you're going to carry it on, well, there's something wrong with you, mate. Isn't that awful? So now, not only are you the victim of the thing that I did, but you're now the horrible person for being victimized by me because I said sorry and you didn't accept it. Good grief. Now, that middle column, guilt, shame, regret, remorse, is also all about the past. These are retrospective emotions. This is important because in order to feel guilty, I must be thinking retrospectively according to time. Same for all the others. So these are retrospective hindsight emotions. Now, anxiety, panic, and worry are about the absence of rules where I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And anxious people generally don't have a hard and fast set of rules by which to act. They are having to try and be what they're supposed to be according to a set of criteria they don't understand, or that is incomplete. What we know is that people who are raised in fairly rigid and authoritarian type environments tend to do quite well. I'm not talking punitive environments. I'm not talking ones that just endlessly punish people, but where the rule structure is fairly strict and rigid. Those people tend to have lower levels of anxiety and greater levels of confidence because they understand who they are. They get what's going on. People who are raised in much more free and easy, ruleless environments are much more prone to anxiety later in life because they don't have a clear set of guidelines on how to behave and what to do. What I know is in hospitals, in hospital departments that I worked in, which can be quite stressful and anxiety-inducing, like the accident and emergency department, there were so many times where I was presented with an emergency, and I was junior. I couldn't be more junior. I'd only recently qualified. And despite being in that situation, I never once got anxious because the guidelines and the rules by which I'm supposed to now act are absolutely defined and non-negotiable. And so I always knew what it was I had to do, as did everybody else. That made teamwork very, very easy because everyone had a highly defined role. Everyone understood what everyone else's role was, so that if a whole group of people suddenly descend into an emergency situation that's presented, as the doors burst open and all the shouting, the story, everyone knows their role and what to do. And it's amazing, actually, how calm everybody was and how much laughing and joking used to go on in some of these situations. Not the stuff they show you on the TV. If we had a much more democratic and easygoing approach where, well, you do what you want to do, you can be really in this environment, you express yourself however you wish. And if you wish to identify as this role today, then you can do that. And if you wish to identify as something else, well, then that's entirely up to you because we're not here to oppress you or to command you or tell you what to be. Wow, that would be a disaster. And yet, for some bizarre reason, culturally, there are sections of culture and then promoted through the media who are encouraging this kind of mindset. And we see the disaster that is spilling out of that in a certain age group of the population. And I personally do not believe this is a particularly healthy or helpful thing for other people. So anxiety, panic, and worry are about the absence of rules. These are also future orientated. So in order to be anxious, we need to be thinking future-based consequences or yet to manifest consequences from the past, and they're yet to manifest as in future-orientated. Panic and worry are also very much about the future. There's a very strong connection between panic and death. If I have somebody who comes to me with panic attacks, I'm going to ask them, so tell me about death, your death. And let's just see what comes back from that individual. Panic is a fear of death. And largely, it's an attempt to bargain with the universe so they're not going to die. They're going to live forever because, that's easy. That's how it works. All you have to do, 3-stage reaction, feel something strong enough. And it shall be your feeling intensity hits a certain level and you command the universe. You command God himself. You change the rules of reality. You shall live forever. You shall not suffer. You shall not cease to exist, which is the most common thing. It's a slightly narcissistic tendency to this panic attack thing. Although panic attackers don't like to hear this, of course, so don't tell them this. But essentially, their panic is a way of bargaining with death. Fear of death goes into a number of categories. Is either the consequences of being dead, and the consequences is one of two things. Consequences to myself, most commonly, I shall cease to exist, or consequences to other, who will look after my children. That's the type of thing. And the other one, which is less common, and we'll see this with health anxiety, is the mechanism of death. So how I will die. And most people have their two favorites, which is the worst possible way I can imagine dying or the most preferable way of going. Some people have their top 10 of each, you know, it's just a hobby for some people. Maybe that was just me when I was younger. So these are about future-based things. Anger and temper are very much about now. These are about this immediate moment. And anger and temper are about somebody else breaking my rules. Now, of course, I can break my rules, so I can be angry at myself. Has the same structure as I'm ashamed of myself. I'm angry at myself. One is an at, one is an of. I will let you work out the differences between those two structures. But I can be angry at myself for breaking the rules that I hold for myself. I let myself down, for example, that kind of thing. And I should never do that. I have a rule: I shall never compromise. I let myself down. I did that yesterday and I'm so angry with myself. So there is your 3 pillars, and that is the explanation I will normally give to depressed clients or anxious clients around this stuff. What I'll then often do with them is I'll say, okay, which one of these it stands out the most for you? Which one is the most common? And they'll go, it'll be guilt. Okay, how strong is guilt? And then work through the structures. Of course, it might well be that in the discussion with them, they have given me things like, I'm ashamed of myself, I get angry at myself, and so forth, in which case I'm going to be working with those as they arise. It can really help to write down some of these sentences so you can calculate them through. So here's a question for you, and here is the consideration for this particular video. If I'm somebody who's very prone to guilt, and guilt is my way of life, this is my primary emotion, it's how I manipulate my family, it's how I identify with people, it's the relationships I form. I'm the person who apologizes when asking for directions. I'm the person who feels guilty if I forget somebody's birthday or something else. I feel guilty over things that don't really matter very much, and I'm regarded as a sensitive person. Now, what personality traits are you likely to see with me? Guilt's a retrospective emotion. So now this is where time orientation and time predication creeps in. And this is some of the work we developed a lot more into the metaphors approach, but it's worth mentioning here. If I'm somebody who's prone to guilt, I'm going to be retrospective. So therefore, I'm somebody who's much more likely to have a very strong sense of heritage, where I've come from. Family is going to be important to me. Nostalgia will be important. Festivals, traditions. I never forget Christmas. I never forget a birthday, because I'm retrospective and I'm anchored in the past. Now, retrospective emotions, retrospective thinking, if I have a strong sense of nostalgia, where I've come from, I'm likely to have quite a strong sense of identity. I might feel guilty about expressing it, but I know who I am. I know who I am, even though I apologize for it. I might not like who I am, but the sense of identity is there, because retrospective emotions are largely about identity, heritage, where we've come from. We're anchored to the past. Anxiety, panic, and worry. So if an anxious person is much more future orientated, the anxious person is much more likely to be thinking about their own future. The panicker will be thinking about their own demise, their own death. So now I'm somebody who's much more likely to be a progressive. I'm much more likely to be future orientated. I might be more likely to be solution focused. And I'm not so connected to my own identity. I might be the people pleaser trying to build a better world. Okay, I don't know who I am. I can't tidy my own room. It's a good reference, Jordan Peterson, but I'm trying to change the world. So if anxious people are progressive, guilty people retrospective, we're much more likely to see this distinction. The person who's prone to guilt, shame, regret, remorse as their way of being is much more likely to be a conservative politically. And there's a whole bunch of stuff you can attach now to that. Their attitudes, their sexual attitudes, their way of living, their values to family and so forth in society, their voting things. But anxious, panicky people are much more likely to be worried about the future. They're much more likely to be progressives, so we're much more likely to see the liberal progressive person who has anxiety. Now, what do we see with our progressives? They're very prone, especially the younger set of progressives at the moment, the blue hair brigade, who have all the pronoun wars and all the stuff that's going on about identity. And this is the thing. Guilt, shame, regret, remorse, anchored in the past, is about who we are, where we've come from. Anxiety, panic, and worry, future, don't have a strong sense of identity. I don't even know what gender I am. I don't even know which pronouns I should be using today because I'm gender fluid. We start to see these bizarre manifestations start to happen that tends to match with progressive attitudes and politics. And those people are very prone to the next column of being angry. So we see these bizarre angry protests that are very popular, shared on social media, of liberal progressives shouting down university professors because they dared use the wrong pronoun or something along those lines. We see very strong things with Antifa being quite violent and aggressive, and yet these are the progressive liberals who are very violent. Now, how do we get conservatives to be violent? You have to make them anxious first. We've got to move them through the things. We have to make them the conservative, guilt-laden person. We need to make them anxious about stuff. They're coming over here taking our jobs. They're coming over here taking our pronouns. You get how that works. Now they're getting anxious about they're losing their stability, and that will make them angry and go off and do the stuff that they do. So we can start to see these three pillars in everyday action. Now, the anger and temper is very much about now. So the person who's prone to anger and temper, they're focused on the immediate now, and often they're focused on you. If you've ever spent time around an angry person, you know that you're scrutinized by the person. The way they watch you, they look at you, the way they listen. Angry people don't listen so easily. They're listening for things to react to. They're often listening to correct you. They won't say, if you write an article or write an essay or write a book, they won't read it. They check it. They look for what's wrong with it. So they might be the critical person. So it doesn't matter what your progressive idea is or what your retrospective is now. They're going to be paying attention to you right here and now and what you've just said and what you've just done. So the three pillars model leaks out into much bigger picture in terms of what kind of personality traits, their time orientation, how that then matches into subcultural groups, political ideologies, and so forth. And for those who are into persuasion and influence, these are things you can really develop into some very interesting areas. I've always said that when Trump in America announced he was running for presidency, and people thought that was hilarious at the time. No one took that seriously. And then he came out with the slogan, "Make America Great Again." And that was an absolute winner. I spotted that immediately that slogan came out. I could see what he'd done. Make America Great is a progressive statement. Again is a retrospective statement. And so that now messes with the progressive conservative narrative. And it was a winner right there, right then. And it could only have done what it did. It couldn't have behaved anywhere else. One simple catchphrase, one simple slogan released into a massive culture, and just watch what happened next. It was phenomenal. And the division between the people who wear the red cap and the people who refuse and won't, and the division between them is remarkable. And you'll start to see three pillars in action with how people behave. How does a person who is absolutely loaded with guilt feel better? Well, they think about the future, because thinking about the future is incompatible to feeling guilty. So the person who is feeling really bad about who they are, they're feeling bad about where they've come from, their identity, their heritage, they don't want to think about those things. They don't want to be responsible for their identity. How can they do that? Well, science fiction. We can be very interested in technology. Progressive politics could take us. We can do all sorts of things where now we become future focused. So we're now into a different level of experience where actually my future focus is relief from my pain. My entertainment takes on future focus. I don't like retrospective period dramas. Oh no, because that then takes me back to horrible times and I don't like that. But future dramas, now that can work for me. So hence science fiction or progressive stuff. How does the anxious person, so that's future focus, how does the anxious person feel better? Nostalgia. They can hark back to a bygone era. And this way it can get interesting. So I'm an anxious person, I want to feel better. I can go to my childhood, so I hang on to things from childhood, or I could go back to before cause. So in timeline therapy, we can regress people back through before cause, past life regression, same principle. What I can do is now I'm very interested in period dramas and history and archaeology and things that are way, way back to before I ever existed, before the problem ever walked this planet. So anxious people can feel better by going back in time. Angry people can feel better, of course, by either thinking about the future or thinking about the past, but never paying attention to the here and now. And this might in part account for why some angry people have absolutely no insight whatsoever into their anger temper behaviors. Because the way they evade the suffering that brings about is simply to change time frame and go to a different time. So you get a classic exchange between the person, which is, I don't like your tone of voice. I mean, you're really angry right now. All right, now let me tell you why I'm so angry. Do you remember when you were 10 years old? Whoa, straight back in time. Or the other one, you're really angry right now. Tell me, I think you need to adjust the way you're speaking to people. All right, so if everyone thought like you, 20 years from now, what would the world become? So the angry person can outframe in time to change the agenda right there, right then. It's a great argumentation technique as well. If you look at politicians or very well trained media people, they utilize time framing and reframing time fantastically. And it's very, very hard to defeat it when someone does it because people can't keep up with what's happening. So now let's make it even more complicated. So the person who's prone to the first column, so we'll just stick with guilt to keep it simple. The guilt-laden person, that might not be their issue. It might have nothing to do with guilt whatsoever. They might be presenting guilt to you. Their real problem is their future and the responsibility for who they're going to become. Because a lot of people hold on to who they are in the face of a changing world. So if I'm feeling guilty and that's my presenting problem, that might be my reason to not think about my future. And I'm using guilt to save me from the reality of my problem, which is what I'm doing with my life and where my life is going. Anxious people might be expressing anxiety the whole time, so they don't have to take responsibility for who they are and where they've come from and their background and their heritage, and they want to detach and dissociate from their identity. We see this, and this is the classic modern phenomenon that we're seeing of white guilt. And I see this a lot on the internet. The progressive liberal, white, middle-class, university, media studies educated male who hates all white people and identifies with working class, ethnic minorities and blacks. It's phenomenal phenomena. A phenomenal phenomena. Because they're very anxious and progressive because they can't take responsibility for the identity, where they've come from and who they are. So now what we can have is emotions that are represented not as a presenting problem, but as a defense to the presenting problem. How would you ever know if this is what's happening with your clients? I have no idea. It's something to be aware of, and you're looking and listening for the linguistic structures that they offer you when they do it. Now, how can a guilty person, so let's make guilt mother, who's the guilt-laden person, and so that's her suffering, how can she feel better? Well, if you're the child, mother who feels guilty can feel better by worrying about your future. Well, what university are you going to go to? Well, what job are you going to do? Well, how are you going to make money then? Well, how are you going to, what's going to happen? So you can't do that. You're going to go there on your own. What do you think? You can't go out wearing those things. What might happen to you? So now, guilt-laden mother relieves her guilt by focusing on your future. Huh. Sounding familiar to some people? Now, what about anxious mother? Anxious mother can now focus on you as the child. And you've seen this, you may well have experienced it. We've probably all done it if you have children, which I don't, of course, so I'm the expert parent. But it's this. Anxious parent focuses on your past. And I might baby talk you. So you might be a 15-year-old, but I talk to you like you're 5. You might be a 40-year-old, and I talk to you like you're 5. I might focus on what a special baby you were, how much better it was when you were younger. And I don't know what's become of you, because when you were younger, you were so special. You were more you when you were younger. And I don't know what's happened to you now, but, oh, let me show you the phone. Do you remember this? Do you remember that time we went on holiday and I trot out the old story? So now what we can have is the parents are using a time frame of your or other experience rather than their own as a way out of their thing. And so these are some of the much more complex considerations it's worth having. I'll leave the comment section on this page open. So if you have examples of this, do please stick them in the comment section, because I'm always interested in other people's experiences and real world examples. Now, the anger temper person. So if I'm always angry, what I can do by being always angry, of course, is I keep the attention on you, the rule breaker, and everyone else. Everyone else is responsible except me. So by being angry, I don't have to be responsible for where I've come from, my background, what sort of child I was, my identity, and I don't have to be responsible for the consequences of my conduct and where I'm going. And when anyone tries to draw me on that, I change time frame, and therefore I evade all insight completely. Fantastic, great strategy. So that's in itself, that's nicely self-contained. But what if I get angry at myself? Now I can be angry at myself now, and then I can remember what you told me when I was younger. I can remember what an awful parent you were. I can remember those times where you had moods and angers, and that's why I'm like I am. Or I can have stories of revenge. I can have stories of vengeance when I will finally defeat the source of my anger, whatever that is. And so now I'm future orientated. I will vanquish and I will be seen as the hero and all the rest. So now I can take future-based fantasies. So what I'm going to invite you to do is this. Pay attention to your fantasies. We all have them, and in varying categories. Pay attention to the time frame of your fantasies. Most of us don't like to look at these things. Our daydream fantasies are just stories we use to entertain ourselves. But pay attention to the structure of them. When you find yourself daydreaming spontaneously, and you can remember to do this, what were you thinking just before? What were you feeling just before? What is the daydream taking you out of? And as you start to get insight into these things, you'll start to see some patterns, and hopefully by understanding them in yourself, you're going to start to see them in other people. Comment section is open below. Do please leave any additional pieces, comments, thoughts, or examples. Any video you see from, say, YouTube or somewhere else that demonstrates some of these examples, do please put them in there.